In that room, silence was more dangerous than any weapon. No one expected the moment that would fracture the entire order of power, but it began with a single breath held too long. The private chamber inside the elite underground venue of New York City was designed for negotiation between men who controlled things unseen: money, influence, silence itself. Victor Moretti sat at the head of the long black table, composed, immovable, a man whose presence alone reduced conversation into submission. Across from him stood Emily Carter, a young waitress who had no place in this world of tailored suits and invisible threats. She had been brought here by mistake, or so everyone believed. The tension in the room was not loud. It was surgical, precise, and suffocating. Victor's voice had already cut through the air earlier, calm but humiliating in its implication, treating her like she did not belong to the same reality. The men around the table had remained still, watching, waiting for the moment she would break. Emily did not. Instead, something shifted in her expression, subtle but irreversible, like a line inside her had finally been crossed. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly at her sides, slowly went still. No one noticed at first. Even Victor did not move, because people like him were used to control, not interruption. But then Emily stepped forward. One step, then another. The room registered the movement too late, as if time itself refused to announce what was coming. Every man in the room, hardened by years of loyalty to fear, felt something unfamiliar tighten in the air. Victor's gaze narrowed slightly, not in concern, but in calculation, as if trying to understand the pattern of an equation that suddenly stopped making sense. Emily stopped directly in front of him. The distance between them was absurd, impossible by every rule this world obeyed. Her voice did not rise. It did not shake. It simply existed in the space between them, firm enough to be heard by everyone, yet quiet enough to feel personal. The words were not what mattered. What mattered was what came after them. A fraction of a second passed where nothing happened, but everything had already changed. The room, full of men who had witnessed violence and power their entire lives, collectively forgot how to react. Victor did not move. Not yet. He only watched her, as if waiting for her to become reasonable again, as if expecting the world to correct itself. But Emily did not correct herself. In that suspended silence, the structure of control that Victor Moretti had built his entire life upon began to crack in ways no one in that room could name. And then, something unthinkable occurred, not as chaos, but as clarity, and every person in the room felt it at the exact same moment. Whatever came next, nothing would remain the same. The silence inside the room did not break immediately after that impossible moment. Instead, it deepened, as if the world itself was waiting to confirm what it had just witnessed. Emily Carter still stood in front of Victor Moretti, her hand lowered now, her breathing steady in a way that surprised even her. She was not smiling, not shaking, not retreating. She simply remained there, as if the rules that governed fear no longer applied to her in the same way. Around them, the men seated at the long black table slowly began to register reality again, but none of them spoke. No one dared to be the first sound in a room that had just been rewritten by a single action. Victor Moretti finally moved, but only slightly. It was not a reaction of anger. It was something more controlled, more unsettling. He leaned back just a fraction in his chair, studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was no longer evaluating a mistake, but a phenomenon he had never encountered before. The power he held in this room had never been questioned in a visible way, not once. Not ever, and yet here stood a woman who had done exactly that without raising her voice beyond a whisper of certainty. Emily did not look away from him. That alone shifted the atmosphere again. In Victor's world, people either broke under pressure or learned to obey it, but Emily was doing neither. She was standing in a space that should not have been available to her, and somehow the room had accepted it. One of the men near the far end of the table shifted, uncomfortably in his seat, but even that small movement felt loud in the tension. Victor's gaze narrowed slightly, not in threat, but in analysis, as though he were trying to locate the point where control had slipped out of his reach and failed to find it. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm, carrying no apology, no hesitation, no attempt to soften what had already happened. The words were simple, but their weight was not. They did not escalate the situation, they clarified it. And in that clarification, something unexpected occurred. The atmosphere did not become more chaotic. It became structured in a new way, as if the entire room had silently agreed that the old hierarchy no longer applied in the same form. Victor did not interrupt her. That, more than anything, unsettled the men around him. The Mafia boss, known for immediate control, immediate consequence, immediate dominance, was simply listening. Not yielding, not agreeing, but listening in a way that suggested he was recalculating something fundamental. Emily's expression did not change as she finished speaking. There was no triumph in her face, no fear either, just presence. And in that presence, every man in the room understood something they could not yet articulate. The balance had shifted, not through force, but through a single moment no one had been able to stop or reverse. Victor finally exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes still locked on hers. Whatever this moment had become, it was no longer about authority alone. It was about something far more dangerous to him, something that could not be measured by power, influence, or fear. It was about the fact that for the first time in his life, someone had stood in front of him and changed nothing by force, but everything by refusing to move. The moment the room went silent still lingered in her mind like a heavy echo she could not shake, as if every second after it had slowed down just enough for her to feel the weight of every gaze that had turned toward her. Emma Collins stood near the edge of the marble lobby, her hands still slightly tense from what had just happened, even though she tried to look calm on the surface. The air conditioning of the high-rise building felt colder now, and every polished surface reflected a version of herself she did not recognize anymore, someone who had crossed an invisible line she never intended to touch. Across the room, Vincent Moretti remained still, his presence changing the atmosphere without him needing to say a single word. He was not reacting the way anyone expected, and that unpredictability only made the tension sharper. People around them, employees, guards, and visitors, avoided eye contact as if looking directly at the situation would make them part of it. Emma could feel her heartbeat in her throat as she tried to understand what would happen next, because nothing about this man suggested he followed normal reactions or predictable patterns. Vincent finally stepped forward, slow and controlled, his expression unreadable in a way that made the space between them feel smaller with every step. When he stopped a few feet away, he did not raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he simply studied her as if trying to understand a problem that had no clear solution. Emma forced herself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct told her to look away, because something about his silence felt more powerful than any reaction she had ever faced before. After a long pause, he spoke in a calm tone that surprised everyone listening, asking her name as if the entire situation had reset itself in his mind. Emma hesitated before answering, unsure whether this was a trap or something even more complicated. Around them, whispers began to spread again, but quieter this time, like the entire building was holding its breath. Vincent motioned slightly with his hand, and instead of escalating the situation, he instructed his staff to clear the area, not with urgency, but with absolute control, as if the decision had already been made long before anyone else realized it. Emma found herself being guided, not forced, toward a quieter section of the building, where the noise of the lobby faded into a distant hum. She did not understand why she was following, but something about his certainty made hesitation feel impossible. When they reached a private office, overlooking the city, the view stretched wide across glass and steel, but Emma could barely focus on it. Vincent finally turned to her fully, and for the first time, his expression softened just slightly, not into warmth, but into curiosity that felt even more unsettling. He asked her why she reacted the way she did earlier, not as an accusation, but as a genuine question, as if he was trying to understand a moment that no one else had ever dared create in his presence. Emma swallowed her fear and answered honestly, saying she did not think before acting, that she only reacted to what she believed was wrong in the moment. The silence that followed was longer than before, and in that silence something shifted that neither of them could define yet. Vincent looked out toward the city for a moment, as if reconsidering every assumption he had ever made about the people around him, while Emma stood still, realizing that walking away now might already be impossible in a way she could not explain. And somewhere between fear and understanding, The first thread of an unexpected connection began to form, quiet and uncertain, but undeniable in its presence. The quiet in the room did not fade even after the conversation shifted. It simply changed shape, becoming something more deliberate, as if the space itself had adjusted to the presence of Vincent Moretti and Emma Collins together in the same enclosed world. Emma stood near the wide glass window of the private office, trying to steady her thoughts while the city below moved in constant motion, cars flowing like distant streams of light across the evening streets. Vincent remained behind her for a moment, not intruding on her space, but not leaving it either, creating a kind of silent boundary that felt intentional rather than accidental. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same controlled calm as before, asking her where she worked, not with suspicion, but with a focus that made the question feel more important than it should have been. Emma hesitated before answering, mentioning the small cafe she worked at in the downtown district, a place far removed from glass towers and private offices like this one. The contrast between her world and his felt sharper when spoken aloud, as if the distance between them had suddenly become measurable in words. Vincent turned slightly, as if considering this information carefully, and then asked another question about her schedule, her hours, and how she ended up in his building earlier that day. Emma explained that she had been delivering an order for a client, a simple task that should have ended without incident, yet somehow had led her into a moment that now felt far larger than its cause. There was a brief pause again, but this time it did not feel tense, only unfinished, like a sentence waiting for its final word. Vincent walked toward a nearby table where a glass of water had been left untouched, and for a moment he simply looked at it before speaking again, saying that most people who entered his world usually did so with intention, not coincidence. Emma frowned slightly at that statement, insisting she had no idea who he was before today, which only made the situation more complicated in her own mind. Instead of dismissing her response, Vincent seemed to accept it without resistance, as if he had already considered that possibility. After a long moment, he made a decision without announcing it directly, simply stating that she would be escorted safely back to her location, but that he would like to continue the conversation at another time. The words were calm, almost polite, but they carried an underlying certainty that left no room for argument. Emma felt a mixture of relief and confusion, unsure whether she was being dismissed or chosen for something she did not yet understand. As she prepared to leave, she noticed how the staff moved efficiently but respectfully, guiding her path without urgency, as if following instructions that had been carefully planned in advance. Vincent watched her for a moment before she exited the office, his expression unreadable again, but different from before, as though something in his perspective had quietly shifted. Outside the building, the night air felt colder than expected, and Emma paused briefly before stepping fully onto the sidewalk, looking back at the towering structure behind her. She did not know why she turned back, only that she felt an unspoken weight pulling her attention toward the man still inside that world of glass and silence. Above her, the city lights continued to glow without interruption, but inside her thoughts, something unfamiliar had already begun to form, something that felt like the beginning of a path she had not agreed to follow, yet could no longer completely ignore. The city felt different to Emma Collins on her way back, not because anything around her had changed, but because something inside her no longer matched the way it had felt only hours before. The sidewalk outside the towering glass building stretched under the soft glow of streetlights, and every step she took carried a weight she could not clearly define. She kept replaying the moment in the office, the calm voice, the controlled silence, the way Vincent Moretti had looked at her, as if she was not just another person passing through his world, but something he was trying to understand rather than dismiss. Back at the cafe where she worked, the evening shift was already beginning, and the familiar sounds of dishes, conversation, and coffee machines should have grounded her, yet they felt strangely distant, like she was listening from behind a thin wall. Her coworker asked her something about the delivery job, but Emma only nodded without fully processing the words, still caught between the ordinary rhythm of her life and the unusual weight of what had just happened. Meanwhile, across the city, Vincent remained in his office long after she had left, standing near the same window where their conversation had paused earlier. The skyline outside glowed in structured patterns of light, But his attention was not on the view. Instead, he was reviewing the brief information she had given him, not as a matter of necessity, but as if trying to place a missing piece into a larger structure that had not been complete before their encounter. For someone like him, control was not just a habit but a foundation, yet today something had interrupted that foundation in a way that did not feel like disruption, but curiosity. He did not call it importance, at least not yet, but he also did not dismiss it, which was rare enough to change the way he approached the rest of his evening. Emma, on the other hand, found herself distracted even by the simplest tasks, dropping a cup slightly while cleaning, then apologizing to no one in particular, as if her thoughts were elsewhere even when her body remained present. The memory of his steady gaze returned repeatedly, not as fear, but as something more confusing, something she could not categorize easily. Later that night, as she walked home under a quieter stretch of streetlights, she noticed a black car parked across the road for a few moments too long, though it did not approach or signal in any way. She told herself it meant nothing, just another vehicle in a busy city, yet she still found herself walking a little faster until it disappeared behind her. In Vincent's world, the night was not ending but continuing through messages, reports, and silent decisions made without urgency. One of his associates mentioned the cafe worker briefly, noting that she had left the building safely and returned to her routine, but Vincent did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood in silence again, looking at the city as if recalculating something internally. When he finally spoke, it was only a short instruction to keep the situation observed without interference, a simple directive that carried more weight than its words suggested. He did not explain why, and no one asked. Back in her small apartment, Emma finally allowed herself to sit still, removing the noise of the day and staring at the dim light of her kitchen. She told herself it was just an unusual encounter, nothing more, something that would fade in time like most strange moments do. But even as she thought it, she knew something about it did not feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something that had already chosen its direction before she had the chance to understand it. The days that followed did not return Emma Collins to anything resembling normal, even though on the surface her life continued exactly the same. She still woke up before sunrise, still took the same bus route to work, still moved through the small cafe. With practiced efficiency, yet something subtle had shifted in the way she experienced each moment. It was not excitement, and it was not fear in the usual sense, but a persistent awareness that lingered beneath everything else, like a quiet background signal she could not turn off. At work, she noticed herself reacting slightly slower to customers, as if part of her attention was always divided between the present and something she could not yet name. Her coworker mentioned again that she seemed distracted, but Emma only offered a small smile and said she was just tired. Meanwhile, Vincent Moretti had returned fully to his structured world of meetings, reports, and decisions that shaped systems far beyond what most people ever saw. Yet even within that environment, his focus was not entirely unchanged. He reviewed information as he always did, but occasionally his attention drifted back to the brief interaction with the cafe worker, not because it disrupted his priorities, but because it did not fit neatly into any category he usually dealt with. There was no transaction, no request, no visible motive. Only a moment of reaction that did not align with the predictable patterns he was accustomed to observing in people around him. That irregularity stayed with him longer than expected, not as an obsession, but as an unresolved variable. One afternoon, Emma found herself walking past the same part of the city where the glass tower stood, though she told herself it was only a coincidence, just a different route home. Still, when she reached the intersection, her steps slowed without clear intention, and she looked up at the building before she could stop herself. The structure remained unchanged, cold and reflective, yet the memory of standing inside it made the space feel different now, almost familiar in a way she did not understand. Inside that same building, Vincent stood near a conference table while others spoke around him, but his attention briefly shifted toward the distant window, as if he sensed nothing but still noticed something beyond the immediate conversation. He did not acknowledge it, and no one in the room observed the change in his focus, yet. Internally, the thought returned without effort. Later that evening, Emma received a message from an unknown number asking simple questions about her availability for a future delivery job, phrased politely, and without detail. She stared at the message longer than she intended, unsure whether to respond, her instincts divided between caution and curiosity. She did not reply immediately, but she also did not delete it. Vincent, at the same time, received a short update confirming that contact information had been obtained through standard channels. Nothing intrusive or irregular, just procedural information that would normally be forgotten within minutes. He acknowledged it without comment, yet chose not to close the file. As night settled over the city again, both of them returned to their separate spaces, unaware that the distance between their worlds was slowly becoming less absolute, not through force or intention, but through a series of small decisions that neither of them fully recognized yet as connection. And in that quiet unfolding, something unspoken continued to form, steady and unavoidable, even if neither of them was ready to call it by name. The city had begun to feel less like a place Emma Collins moved through and more like a system that occasionally moved around her, shaping small coincidences that she could not fully explain. The message from the unknown number remained on her phone longer than she expected, sitting there through her next shift at the cafe and into the late evening hours, as if waiting for a decision that carried more weight than it should. She told herself it was likely just a standard follow-up for delivery work, something harmless and routine, yet her hesitation grew each time she looked at it again. When she finally responded, it was brief and cautious, confirming only basic availability without offering anything personal. After sending it, she immediately regretted how much attention she had given to something so small, but the feeling did not fade. Across the city, Vincent Moretti received the reply through one of his channels without needing to actively request it. He read it once, then again, not because it was complex, but because it confirmed continuity, a willingness to engage without resistance. He did not interpret it emotionally, but he noted the pattern, and in his world patterns mattered more than impressions. He instructed no immediate response, instead choosing to observe the timing of her next actions, as if the interaction were part of a larger structure still forming. Emma, meanwhile, found herself thinking about the situation during quiet moments, especially when the cafe was slow and the noise around her faded into background sounds of cups and conversation. She noticed small things more sharply now, like unfamiliar cars passing too slowly outside the cafe windows or brief pauses in foot traffic that seemed slightly out of place. None of it was definitive enough to confirm anything, yet together it created a sense of awareness she had not felt before. One evening, as she left work later than usual, she noticed again a dark vehicle parked farther down the street, positioned in a way that made it difficult to determine whether it was simply waiting or observing. She did not stop walking, but her pace remained steady and deliberate until she turned onto a brighter street where the presence of other people felt more constant. At the same time, Vincent reviewed a report that mentioned her routine movements between work and home, not detailed in an invasive way, but recorded through standard external observation channels he had authorized in a limited capacity. He did not expand the scope, nor did he reduce it, maintaining a controlled distance that reflected his usual approach to uncertainty. However, his attention lingered slightly longer on her pattern of movement than it did on other entries in the report, and he recognized that this was becoming less about information and more about expectation. Emma's life continued its normal structure. Yet within that structure, she began to notice the absence of randomness, as if certain elements of her days were subtly aligning around something she could not yet identify. She did not tell anyone about the message or the feeling that followed it, because she could not explain it in a way that would make sense even to herself. Vincent, on the other hand, did not speak of her at all, but he began to adjust his schedule in small ways that were not necessary for his work, though he did not yet define the reason. And as both of them moved through their separate nights under the same city sky, the distance between their lives remained intact in appearance, but no longer in certainty, as if something quiet and deliberate had already begun connecting what neither of them had agreed to join. By the time the city reached its quietest hour, everything between Emma Collins and Vincent Moretti had already shifted into something neither of them had explicitly chosen, yet both were now unconsciously maintaining. Emma sat near her small kitchen table, the dim light above her flickering slightly as she stared at her phone without touching it, the message from the unknown number still visible even though no new words had appeared. She told herself she should delete it, forget it, return fully to the rhythm of her normal life. But her hand did not move. Instead, she found herself thinking about patterns she had started noticing, the same subtle repetition of unfamiliar presence at a distance, the same feeling that certain moments in her day no longer belonged entirely to chance. Across the city, Vincent Moretti stood alone in a quiet office that overlooked a sleeping skyline, the city lights below forming a structure of order that mirrored his own internal discipline. Yet tonight, his attention was not on systems or reports, but on a timeline of movement that had been placed before him, detailing Emma Collins' most recent days in simple, factual segments. He did not look for meaning beyond what was necessary, but he could not ignore the consistency forming within those segments, a consistency that suggested not interference, but alignment. He closed the file briefly, then reopened it, a rare repetition in his otherwise final decision-making process, as if confirming that the information remained unchanged and therefore required consideration rather than dismissal. Emma eventually stood from her table and moved toward the window of her small apartment, looking out at the distant glow of the city. Wondering why everything felt slightly closer than it should. It was not fear that defined her thoughts anymore, but awareness, a quiet understanding that something beyond her control had already begun interacting with her daily life in ways she could not fully see. She did not know Vincent Moretti's current thoughts, just as he did not know the exact shape of her uncertainty. Yet both of them were now operating within the same invisible structure without acknowledging it openly. Later that night, Vincent made a single adjustment to his schedule, not to pursue, not to escalate, but to ensure proximity within controlled limits, a decision made without explanation and without urgency. It was a small change, almost invisible on paper, yet it represented something neither of them had experienced before in relation to each other, a deliberate reduction of distance without direct contact. Emma, meanwhile, received no additional message, but the absence of communication itself began to feel like part of a larger design rather than a pause. She lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet sounds of the building, aware that her thoughts kept returning to the same uncertain point without resolution. Vincent remained in his office until the early hours, not because of obligation, but because leaving felt premature in a way he could not justify logically. When he finally turned away from the window, the city remained unchanged, yet his awareness of it had subtly shifted. Neither of them spoke, neither of them acted directly toward the other, but the space between their lives no longer behaved like separation. It had become something more precise, something measured in attention rather than distance, and in that quiet realization, the beginning of a path neither had chosen but both were now following became unmistakably present.